When my grandson said those words, "Grandma, just wait at the motel, we'll pick you up before dinner," something inside me cracked, though I smiled as if it didn't. I nodded, polite as ever, the way a woman of my generation was taught to be. But beneath the nod, beneath the practiced smile, was a raw sting I hadn't felt in years. It was the kind of sting you feel when someone you love brushes you aside, not with cruelty, but with a casualness so sharp it cuts deeper than anger ever could. They didn't mean harm, I told myself. They were just being practical. But still, I heard it for what it was. I wasn't wanted on the adventure. I was being left behind. I sat on the edge of the stiff motel bed after they left, staring at the patterned carpet that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and old dust. My suitcase sat zipped in the corner, a little too neat, as if it belonged to someone passing through but never really arriving. The room felt airless, though the small window rattled with the wind outside. My fingers twisted the hem of my blouse, an old nervous habit I thought I'd long abandoned. I was 71 years old, and here I was, reduced to the awkward stillness of a child waiting for permission. Permission that, apparently, wasn't coming. It wasn't the first time I'd been asked to sit this one out. Over the years, it had happened in little ways, at family dinners where the conversation sped past me like a train I couldn't board, or when vacations were planned and I was invited only for the easier parts. But this time was different. This was supposed to be my trick too. I had saved for it, packed for it, dreamed of it. And yet, with one simple sentence, I had been shifted from participant to bystander. They hadn't even looked back to see how I took it. That, I think, was the hardest part. I sat for a long while, listening to the ticking of the motel clock. At first, I tried to busy myself, poured a cup of weak coffee from the room's machine, flipped through the local brochure they'd left on the table. But nothing settled me. Each small action felt hollow, as if I were pretending to be someone content with waiting. My chest felt tight, the kind of tightness that comes when you're holding back tears but refusing to let them show. I've always been proud of not crying easily. But pride, I've learned, can feel like a heavy coat in the heat, stifling, suffocating, unnecessary. I thought about calling an old friend, just to have someone to talk to, but the idea embarrassed me. What would I say? That my family told me to sit quietly while they went off and lived? That I felt like luggage left in storage, not a person with breath and thoughts? No, I couldn't bring myself to put that into words aloud. Instead, I pressed my hand against the small of my back, it always ached after sitting too long, and whispered, just to myself, "I won't wait." The sound of my own voice startled me, as though I had broken some silent pact. But once said, it couldn't be unsaid. And something inside me shifted. I rose slowly, my knees stiff but determined. I looked at the mirror above the dresser, a harsh mirror, the kind that shows every line on your face, every shadow beneath your eyes. For a moment, I almost faltered. The woman staring back at me looked tired, her hair a little too thin, her shoulders sloping with age. She did not look like someone who belonged out in the world alone. She looked like someone meant for quiet corners and waiting rooms. But then, I thought, perhaps that's exactly why I had to go. Because if I didn't move now, I never would again. I slipped on my walking shoes, not stylish, but sturdy, and reached for my small handbag. I didn't carry much these days. A wallet, a scarf folded neatly, a small notebook I kept for jotting stray thoughts. I touched the scarf as I tucked it in. It had been a gift from my late husband, and though he'd been gone for over a decade, the fabric still carried, in my mind, the faint scent of the cologne he used to wear. It steadied me. Not because it made me feel less alone, but because it reminded me that I had lived a life with choices once, and I could choose again. The motel door stuck slightly as I pushed it open, the frame swollen from years of weather. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine and dust. A long road stretched ahead, curving toward the hills where my family had gone. I didn't know exactly where they were, but I knew the general direction. I had seen the signs, the tourist maps. And truly, I didn't need to arrive at the exact same place. I just needed to arrive somewhere. Anywhere that wasn't a dim motel room waiting for someone else to decide when I could be part of life again. I began walking. At first, every step felt heavy, my body protesting the sudden demand. But as I moved, the stiffness eased, replaced by a rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. Cars passed now and then, their drivers glancing at me, some curious, some indifferent. I kept my eyes forward. For once, I wasn't concerned with how I looked, not whether my blouse matched my shoes, not whether my hair was too windblown. There was a strange freedom in that, a loosening of a knot I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. I passed a small diner after a mile or so, its neon sign flickering even in daylight. Something compelled me to stop. Not because I was hungry, but because I wanted to sit somewhere that wasn't a motel room, somewhere alive. Inside, the smell of frying bacon and coffee wrapped around me like a blanket. The waitress, a woman about my daughter's age, smiled faintly and led me to a booth by the window. I ordered tea. As I stirred in the sugar, I noticed my hands were trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from adrenaline. I was doing something I wasn't supposed to do. Something unsanctioned. And instead of shame, I felt a spark, small, but real. As I sat there, watching the road through the diner's smudged glass, I thought about all the times I had waited. Waited for my husband to come home from work before making plans. Waited for my children to decide if they needed me before I dared book anything for myself. Waited for invitations to life rather than stepping into it uninvited. I had become an expert in waiting, and the years had slipped by like pages turning too quickly to read. But now, with a chipped porcelain cup warming my palms, I realized I didn't want to wait anymore. Not here, not anywhere. That thought carried me out of the diner and back onto the road. The hills rose higher in the distance, a promise of something beyond. My legs ached, my back complained, but I pressed on. Each step was a statement, a refusal to be left behind. I wasn't chasing my family anymore, not exactly. I was chasing myself, the version of me I had buried beneath politeness and patience. The woman who once dreamed of seeing the world, who once danced in the kitchen when no one was looking, who once believed her story wasn't finished. And as the sun shifted, casting longer shadows on the road ahead, I knew with a quiet certainty, this was only the beginning. The road stretched longer than I expected. From the motel, the hills had looked closer, their green curves folding into one another like the edges of a blanket. But once I was on the road, I saw how distance plays tricks. What seems near is often miles away. Each step carried me farther from the safe familiarity of four walls, and yet, I felt lighter than I had in months. Perhaps years. The traffic thinned as I walked, replaced by stretches of silence where only the sound of my shoes on gravel marked the passage of time. The silence wasn't empty, though. It was full of small details I'd forgotten to notice in the busy noise of family gatherings. The rustle of dry grass as the wind bent it, the cry of a hawk circling overhead, the faint perfume of wildflowers that had sprung up uninvited along the ditch. I realized how little attention I'd given to such things lately. My world had shrunk to family schedules, polite smiles, and waiting rooms. Out here, even in the ache of my knees, there was more life than I had allowed myself in years. But fatigue is its own kind of companion, and soon it joined me. My legs began to stiffen, my breath grew shallow, and the sun pressed down on my shoulders with a weight that no scarf could soften. I stopped by a fence, leaning against the rough wood. It pressed splinters into my palm, but I welcomed the sting. It reminded me I was here, still choosing to stand, still choosing to move. I thought of them, my daughter, my son-in-law, my grandson. At that very moment, they were probably laughing together, perhaps hiking a trail or exploring a gift shop. I tried to picture them noticing my absence, wondering if they'd say, "Oh, she'll be fine, she's resting." Or perhaps not mention me at all. I don't know which hurt more, to be pitted as fragile, or to be forgotten entirely. A car slowed near me, a dented pickup with a man behind the wheel. His face was weathered, the skin browned from years in the sun. He leaned across the seat and called, "You all right, ma'am?" For a heartbeat, pride made me want to wave him on. But something softer, truer, made me answer. just catching my breath. "You need a ride?" he asked. The offer hung in the air like a test. For most of my life, I would have said no instantly, afraid of the unknown, afraid of being a burden, afraid of how I might look. But now, standing on the side of the road with the sweat gathering at the back of my neck, I thought, why not? "Yes, thank you," I said, surprising myself. He pulled over, and I climbed in, careful of my knees. The truck smelled of oil and tobacco, not unpleasant, just lived in. We rode in silence at first, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. Then he asked, "Where are you headed?" I hesitated. "Just forward," I said, and he chuckled softly. "Ain't that the truth?" he muttered, as if the words meant something to him too. We drove for a few miles before he let me out near a crossroads, where a small market stood with faded paint and a crooked sign. I thanked him, and he tipped his hat, as though I had done him a kindness rather than the other way around. When he drove off, I felt a strange surge in my chest, not just gratitude, but proof that I could depend on the kindness of strangers when I'd long been told to depend only on family. The market was quiet inside, a few shelves of canned goods, a cooler humming loudly in the corner. I bought a bottle of water and sat outside on the bench. The cold plastic in my hand was a relief. As I drank, I watched people come and go, a young mother with her child tugging at her sleeve, an older man carrying a bag of apples. Each moved with a purpose. And for the first time in a long while, so did I. I thought about calling my daughter to tell her where I was. The phone was right there in my bag, heavy with unspoken words. But I didn't. What would I say? That I couldn't sit in that motel, that I needed to move, that being asked to wait made me feel invisible? The words seemed impossible to say without sounding petty or fragile. And maybe I didn't want to explain. Maybe this journey wasn't theirs to understand. Instead, I opened my little notebook and wrote a few lines. Nothing profound, just, I walked. I did not wait. I went forward. The words looked small on the page, but they felt larger than anything I had written in years. When I stood again, my body protested, but I kept moving. I passed fields dotted with cows, their slow chewing a rhythm of its own. I passed a mailbox leaning crooked, painted with sunflowers long faded. The world was full of signs of lives lived, imperfect and enduring. I thought of my own life, of the places where I had leaned crooked but still stood. I was tired, yes. I was older, yes. But I was not finished. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows lengthened, and doubt crept in again. What was I doing? I wasn't young, I wasn't strong. I should have been resting in that motel room, waiting like they asked. The sensible part of me whispered all the warnings. What if I fell? What if I got lost? What if something happened and no one knew where I was? Those were the voices I had lived with for decades, the voices that kept me in the safe corners of life. But another voice, smaller, quieter, but persistent, whispered back, and what if nothing happens at all? What if waiting is the only real danger? That thought carried me further. And with each step, the ache in my body became less of a burden and more of a reminder I was alive. Truly alive, not just surviving, not just watching others live. Every twinge, every blister was proof that I was moving forward by my own will. By evening, I reached a ridge where the view opened wide. The valley below stretched in golden light, dotted with houses and the shimmer of a river winding through. I sat on a rock, my chest heaving, and let the sight settle into me. It was not a grand discovery, not a hidden wonder of the world, but it was mine. Mine because I had walked here, mine because I had refused to wait. The air cooled, and I pulled out my husband's scarf, wrapping it around my shoulders. The fabric was thin, worn from years, but it carried me through that moment like a hand on my back. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I'm still here." And for the first time in a very long time, I believed it. Night settled more quickly than I expected. The golden light of the valley dimmed to gray, and with it came the sharp reminder that I was not at home, not even in a familiar place. I was an old woman alone on the edge of a ridge, holding nothing more than a scarf, a half-empty water bottle, and a stubborn sense that I could not turn back. The sensible voice rose again, louder this time, telling me I was foolish, reckless, maybe even selfish. But another voice, the one that had carried me this far, whispered still, "Keep going. You are not finished yet." I descended carefully, my knees complaining with each step. Darkness has a way of magnifying sounds, and every rustle in the brush sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it was nothing more than rabbits or wind. But I gripped the scarf tighter, as though cloth could defend me from fear. My breath came heavy, and for a moment I almost turned back. Then I saw a small light flickering below, not the cold shine of a street lamp, but the warm glow of a porch. It was a farmhouse, paint peeling, but the windows bright. I made my way toward it, relief softening the knot in my chest. A dog barked, deep and sudden, and I froze. But the door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was middle-aged, her hair tied back, her hands still carrying the flour of whatever she had been baking. She looked at me with surprise but not suspicion. "Evening," she said, her voice steady. "You lost?" I hesitated. "Not lost. Just walking." She studied me for a moment, then nodded, as if she understood more than I had said. "Well, come sit a spell. You look tired." Inside, the house smelled of bread and wood smoke. I sat at her kitchen table while she poured me a glass of water. The dog curled under a chair, watchful but calm. She didn't press me with questions, only offered a slice of warm bread and a gentle silence. I ate slowly, the crust crackling beneath my teeth, and felt a gratitude so sharp it almost made me cry. Not for the bread itself, but for being treated not as fragile luggage, but as a person. A traveler, even. When I finally spoke, it came out softer than I intended. "My family left me at a motel. Said they'd come back for me later." Her brow furrowed, but she didn't pity me. "Instead," she said, "and you didn't wait." I shook my head. "No. I didn't." A small smile touched her lips. "Good for you." Those 3 words wrapped around me like another kind of scarf, warm and steadying. She didn't know me, didn't know my years of waiting, my quiet invisibility. Yet in that simple phrase, she gave me permission I hadn't known I still needed. I stayed only long enough to rest, then thanked her and moved on. She pressed an apple into my hand before I left. "For the road," she said, and I carried it carefully, as though it were something rare. The road narrowed as I continued, bordered now by trees that whispered with the night wind. My body hurt, there was no denying it. Each step was an argument with my joints, each breath a reminder of my age. But alongside the ache was something else, something new. A sense of companionship with myself. For so long, I had lived as if my worth was measured by how useful I was to others, how quietly I could fit into their plans. Out here, with no one watching, I was discovering what it meant to simply be with myself. To move not for them, but for me. I thought back to when I was younger, before marriage, before children. I had dreams then, though I can hardly remember them now. I wanted to travel, to learn another language, to paint perhaps. But life, as it often does, had other plans. And I adjusted, gladly at first, then gradually, then resentfully. Somewhere along the way, I stopped even remembering that I once had my own desires. I became mom, then grandma, identities I wore proudly, but ones that sometimes smothered the quieter parts of me. Now, walking in the dark, I felt those old desires stir like embers under ash. Not in grand, impossible ways, I no longer longed for Paris or for oil paints. But in small, stubborn ways. To see new things, to go places without asking, to sit in a diner and order tea without waiting for someone else to decide. To live, however modestly, as a person still capable of choosing. Hours passed in that rhythm of thought and step. When at last I reached another cluster of lights, I found myself at a small roadside inn. Its sign buzzed faintly, promising vacancy. I entered, my body near trembling with exhaustion. The man at the desk looked at me without judgment, handed me a key, and pointed to a room upstairs. The bed was softer than the motel's, though my body hurt too much to care. I lay down fully clothed, the apple still on the nightstand, the scarf still around my shoulders. Before I drifted into sleep, I whispered once more, I didn't wait. The words were a lullaby and a promise. Morning came with pale light through thin curtains. I rose stiffly, but with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. My family had not called, not once. I checked my phone, no messages. At first, it stung, sharp and cold. Then, slowly, I let it settle. Their silence no longer defined me. If they saw me only as someone to wait, then let them. I knew otherwise now. I washed my face in the inn's small sink, combed my hair, and wrapped the scarf once more. Looking in the mirror, I saw the same lined face, the same thinning hair. But behind the eyes, something was shifting. A glimmer, faint but real, of the girl I had been before the years told me to wait quietly. She was not gone. She was here, still. And she was ready to keep going. The morning air was cool as I stepped outside the inn, the apple core from last night tucked into the trash, the scarf neat across my shoulders. I moved more slowly than I had hoped. Sleep had soothed me, but it had not erased the ache from my bones. Still, I kept going. The road curved ahead into stretches of farmland, dotted with barns leaning into the years, and I thought, this is the life I almost missed because I was supposed to wait in a room with stale curtains. But the quiet wasn't kind forever. By noon, doubt returned like a shadow that could not be outrun. My legs dragged, my chest tightened, and with every step I thought of the motel bed I had left behind. What was I proving? That I could walk a road my family had chosen for me not to take? That I could still endure discomfort when I should have been resting? The question stung because I had no easy answers. I only knew that if I turned back now, I would be surrendering to that old life of waiting, and I couldn't bear it. I stopped at a shaded patch beneath a tree, sitting on the rough ground, pulling the scarf close around me. My phone was still in my bag. For a long while, I stared at it, half hoping it would ring on its own. Half dreading it would. When it remained silent, I unlocked it and saw their photos, my daughter smiling, my grandson with his young, careless joy. My throat tightened. I could call, tell them where I was, ask them to come get me. But then what? They'd arrive, gently scolding, treating me like a child who'd wandered too far. They'd drive me back to a chair in the corner, and I'd let them. And all this, the walking, the bread in a stranger's kitchen, the inn's thin curtains, would vanish into nothing. So I put the phone away. The silence was heavy, but it was mine. By the time I reached the next town, my body was trembling with exhaustion. I found a bench outside a small park and sat, trying to steady my breath. Children ran through the grass, their laughter carrying like bells. I watched a little girl fall and scrape her knee. She cried, but then she stood, brushed at the blood, and kept running. Her mother didn't rush to scoop her up. She simply called out, "You're all right. Keep going." Those words struck me harder than I expected. You're all right. Keep going. Simple, ordinary words, but I couldn't remember the last time anyone had said them to me. More often, I was told, don't overdo it. Sit down. Wait here. And in the absence of encouragement, I had begun to believe that was all I was capable of. Watching that child, I realized how much I had needed someone to tell me I could stand, even if I stumbled. No one had said it, so I had said it to myself, step after step, mile after mile. I bought a sandwich from a corner cafe, ate it slowly on the bench, and let the world pass by around me. People were busy, carrying groceries, pushing strollers, holding hands. I felt both apart from them and strangely connected, as though I was seeing life with fresh eyes, not from behind a window, but in the middle of it. Still, the loneliness pressed in. It was one thing to feel invisible among strangers, another to feel forgotten by those you loved most. I couldn't help but imagine their day. Had they returned to the motel and found me gone? Had they worried, or had they simply assumed I was resting? That thought burned. To be mistaken for someone content with waiting, when every fiber of me screamed otherwise, that was the cruelest cut of all. As evening neared, I wandered toward the edge of town, where a small river wound past the trees. I sat on a low stone wall, listening to the water. My legs ached, my hands shook, and yet, there was peace in the sound of that river. I thought of my husband again, how he used to say life moved like water, sometimes slow, sometimes rushing, but always forward. When he died, I thought the river of my life had ended. But perhaps, I realize now, it had only narrowed into still pools. Waiting at motels, waiting in corners. What I was doing now, these steps, these small acts of going forward, they were the current starting again. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of water fill me, until I felt the prick of tears. Not tears of weakness, but of release. For years I had swallowed them, determined to appear strong. But out here, with no one to comfort or to judge, I allowed myself to weep quietly. For the years spent waiting. For the moments missed. For the fact that I had allowed myself to disappear piece by piece into the background of my own life. When the tears dried, I stood again. My body was weary, but my heart felt steadier. I had faced the loneliness, the ache, the silence, and still, I was here. Still moving. Still choosing. That night, I found another small inn. The bed was lumpy, the sheets thin, but I slept deeply. When morning came, I tied the scarf tighter and whispered again the words I had carried with me from the start. I did not wait. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, I knew this much: I was stronger than they believed. Stronger than even I had believed. This was not defiance for its own sake anymore. This was reclamation. The fifth morning began with clouds low over the horizon, the kind that promise rain without deciding when. I set out from the inn, my body slow to obey but my mind sharper than it had been in years. Every step now felt deliberate. I was no longer proving something only to them, my daughter, my grandson, my son-in-law, but to myself. To the woman who had once let her voice be swallowed by "wait here and we'll come get you." The road into town was busier that day. Cars hummed by, families passed with backpacks and cameras, and for the first time, I felt exposed. Not in a fragile way, but in a way that said, "Look at me, I am here, I am moving forward." I stopped at a bakery, drawn by the smell of bread warming the air. The woman behind the counter greeted me without the false cheer reserved for old ladies. She looked me in the eye, asked, "What can I get you?" as though my choice mattered. I ordered a roll, and when she handed it to me, warm and fragrant, I thought, this is what it feels like to be seen. I sat outside, eating slowly, when I heard a voice that stopped my breath. My grandson's. Clear, bright, unmistakable. He was laughing, the kind of laugh only the young have, unburdened by weight or worry. I turned before I could think, and there they were, my family, walking up the street, their faces lit with vacation joy. For a moment, time froze. I could have hidden, ducked into the bakery, spared myself what came next. But something steadier than fear held me there. My daughter's eyes found mine first. She stopped, shock flashing across her face. "Mom?" My son-in-law slowed, confusion tightening his brow. My grandson blinked, then grinned. "Grandma! What are you doing here?" The question pierced me. What was I doing here? I could hear the expected answers. I got lost, I was worried, I was trying to catch up. But none of them were true. What I was doing here was claiming my place in a world that had asked me to sit aside. So I lifted my chin, steadier than I felt, and said, "I walked." They stared, waiting for more. My daughter's lips parted, ready to scold, to call me reckless, to wrap me in the soft prison of concern. But I didn't give her the chance. "You told me to wait at the motel," I said quietly. "I didn't." Her face flushed, shame flickering across her eyes. She reached out, but I stepped back, holding her gaze. I am not luggage. I am not something to be left in a corner until you're ready for me. I came on my own. And I'll keep going on my own. The silence that followed was thick, the kind that makes people shift their feet, search for words. My grandson broke it first, his young voice cutting clear. That's cool, Grandma. He said it with a grin, simple and true, without pity. And in that moment, it was enough. I didn't wait for them to respond further. I finished my roll, brushed the crumbs from my lap, and stood. Enjoy your day, I said, not unkindly. And then I turned back to the road. Every step away from them hurt. Not my legs, though they screamed, but my heart. These were my people, my blood, my love. To walk away was to accept that they might never see me as I saw myself in that moment. But to stay would be worse. To stay would be to return to the waiting, to the silence, to the invisibility. As I left the town behind, the clouds finally broke and rain began to fall. Cold drops ran down my face, soaking the scarf, clinging to my blouse. But I didn't rush for cover. I let it wash me, strip me of the weight I had carried, baptize me in a new truth. I was no longer waiting for permission to live. By the time the rain eased, I was shivering, but there was fire in me too. I had faced them, faced the very people who had, without meaning harm, diminished me into a shadow. And I had said no. Quietly, but firmly. That no was my yes to myself. When I reached the next ridge, breathless and soaked, I stopped and looked back. The town lay below, small against the sweep of hills. Somewhere in those streets, my family continued their day, perhaps confused, perhaps chastened, perhaps indifferent. I didn't know. But I knew this, I was not in the motel anymore. I was not on the bench of waiting. I was here, on the ridge, with the road ahead. I pressed my hand to the scarf, whispering, I walked. And in that whisper was everything. The morning after the rain was clear and sharp, the air washed clean as though the world itself had taken a deep breath. I rose stiffly from the bed at another roadside inn, my clothes still damp from where they had hung overnight, the scarf softer now with the weight of water and time. When I looked in the mirror, the face staring back was the same lines, the same thinning hair, but the eyes were not. There was something steadier in them, something I had thought lost long ago. I packed my small bag with practiced ease, but this time, the gesture felt different. I wasn't preparing to be moved along by someone else's plan, I was preparing myself for wherever I chose to go. That distinction was everything. Outside, the road stretched wide and open, the fields glistening with dew. Birds moved through the sky, unbothered by boundaries, unhurried by clocks. I walked slowly, each step deliberate, not because I was weary, though I was, but because I wanted to feel every part of it. The gravel underfoot, the cool air filling my lungs, the quiet insistence of my heartbeat. This was mine. At a bend in the road, I stopped by a small wooden bridge crossing a stream. The water rippled below, restless and free. I leaned against the rail, the scarf brushing my cheek, and thought about what it meant to arrive. Not at a destination, not at some scenic point with cameras waiting, but at a place within myself. A place where I no longer needed to be asked along, or waited for, or told when it was my turn. I was here because I had walked. Because I had chosen. I thought of my family, somewhere behind me. Maybe they were searching, maybe they had dismissed it all as a strange whim. I didn't know, and for the first time, I realized I didn't need to. Love, after all, does not mean erasing yourself to be convenient. Love can hold boundaries. Love can say no. And in that no, there is dignity. I pulled the notebook from my bag, opened to a fresh page, and wrote, I was left behind, and I walked forward. I did not wait. I found myself again on the road, and she was worth finding. The words were shaky, uneven, but they were mine. I tore the page free and folded it carefully, tucking it into the scarf's corner. Not for anyone else to read, but for me to carry, close to my skin. As the sun climbed, I kept walking, not fast, not far, but enough. Each mile was no longer about distance, it was about presence. The simple act of not waiting. The steady reminder that even at 71, even with aching knees and a body that had learned stillness too well, I could move forward. When I reached another small town, I stepped into a cafe. The waitress greeted me warmly, and I ordered tea. As I stirred the sugar, I noticed my hands weren't trembling this time. They were steady. I lifted the cup, breathed in the steam, and thought, this is living. Not waiting for someone else to bring the world to me, but finding it, sip by sip, step by step. I didn't need to tell anyone what I had done. I didn't need recognition, or apology, or even understanding. What I needed, I had already given myself, the proof that I could still choose, still go, still exist in the world beyond the waiting room. And as I finished my tea, tied the scarf tighter, and stepped back into the light, I knew this truth would stay with me. I was no longer the woman left behind. I was the woman who walked forward. And I would never wait again.